Hi there, Brian. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. It's great to meet you. Thanks for talking with Dread Central today.
Of course, I love Dread Central.
Thank you. So, congrats on Queer for Fear. How would you describe that project to people that don't know about it?
Well, I think it's the history of queer horror, and obviously it's such a broad history that we have to find these entry points for different subjects that are the kind of topic sentences for each of the episodes.
Mhm.
And I would think for queer audiences, it's going to be a lot of fun to understand perhaps why they had attractions to certain horror stories. And I think for straight audiences, it's going to be a complicated experience because, whether they're allies or not, we're going to come across those people who are going to say, like, not everything is queer. And with horror, a lot of it is.
Yeah, they're
So
wrong. It's all
yeah,
queer.
yeah,
Um,
that's a pill they're going to have to swallow.
there's a lot of talk of historical figures from Mary Shelley to Bram Stoker. I'm wondering, are there anyone queer moments from history that people are especially surprised by? Are there queer creators that people just really didn't see coming?
Well, I definitely think Bram Stoker and Mary Shelley. I didn't realize either of them were queer before setting out on this documentary journey. And so much of what we have in the stories, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I did know, and but like so much more that I didn't. And that was really satisfying for me as an audience member. And so it's really trying to create a salon style conversation with really interesting people who have affiliations with horror and queerness, talking about the history of these things in a way that feels like we're all gathered at the Algonquin with Dorothy Parker, except Dorothy Parker happens to be Karin Kusama or Kimberly Pierce or Jasmine Savoy Brown or Nay Beaver. So it's that part is really fun for me, and also very satisfying because it's giving an ownership of horror to queers that we've always felt, but now this is kind of like the proof and why we do have foundational ownership of the genre.
I remember growing up clocking queer coded horror for the first time with Fright Night. I was
Yeah,
wondering,
yeah.
do you remember the first time for you where you were younger and you thought, what's going on here?
There's I would say very early on, there was of course the commercials for monster cereals and the intimate clutching of Count Chocula and Frankenberry, and them sharing beds, uh,
Okay.
those types of things where I was like, oh, they have a different relationship than the relationships I usually see. But Fright Night was one of the times where I was uh, blown away
Yeah.
at the dynamics of Evil Ed and Jerry Dandridge in that alleyway. And I saw it. I think I was 15 or 14 or 15 when I
Yeah.
saw it. So I was right smack dab in like compulsive masturbatory behavior, that if I was alone, I was masturbating, and I couldn't get home fast enough on my bicycle after watching Fright Night to rub one out because I was so charged by that
It's
dynamic.
hot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It
incredibly sexy.
yeah, oh
And
yeah, it super is.
it's
Uh
aspirational because we all hope that there will be somebody that comes into our life that can normalize what we're feeling in some way.
as a queer filmmaker, have you ever had the need to queer code within your own work? Because you weren't allowed to go surface.
There's been many a times where I attempted to be explicit in queer representation and had studios de-queer those characters, or an actor's manager de-queer a character, and say horrible things like the worst thing that my client could do is play a queer person.
Ugh.
And that's still relatively recent history. So I've had many different kind of experiences of trying to put explicit queerness on the screen, and to be heavily thwarted, whether it's by Fox or MGM or whoever I'm working with that simply does not want to tell those stories and does not want to have that community represented. So it's been an interesting adventure over the last 25 years that I've been telling stories.
Would you say Hannibal is queer coded, or do you think it's sort of surface there?
I think it was something that was like, it becomes explicit. I think because it's a fascinating relationship between a man who identifies as heterosexual and an entity that is perhaps pansexual, but sexuality is fluid.
Mhm.
And what you identify with may be different if you're in an other state of consciousness or vulnerability, or the proverbial six-pack of beer that liquidates people's sexual identities in a way that becomes much more fluid. So I think it started out exploring romantic tendencies between a same-sex couple that was not necessarily sexualized, that was then building toward a sexual vulnerability between them that resulted in the metaphor of a dramatic three-way, where each of them were penetrating another man in a way that brought them closer together. And so there is metaphor in that, but I don't think it's coded.
Yeah, I
It feels.
agree. Yeah. Why do you think queer people are so drawn to horror?
Well, I think their horror usually hinges on survival narratives, and I think queer people have a different relationship with survival than perhaps folks that aren't within a marginalized community. And we think about survival more often than people who aren't in marginalized communities do. And whether that is fearing that we're going to be queer bashed or rejected by loved ones, or is it going to be verbal humiliation, physical humiliation, violence, death? We all have to think about those things as we navigate spaces that aren't designed for us to be safe in. And I think queer people look at these horror narratives and they see survival tales, and that resonates. And I'll quote something that Amy Steele said in a conversation I had with her about playing Jenny Field in the Friday the 13th film, was that when she interacts with fans at these signings, there's one faction of fans that are fetishizing Jason and her relationship with him, but it's really about Jason Voorhees. And the queer fans are fetishizing her because she survived that narrative. And if she can survive that narrative, then they can survive whatever they're going through. And that's one of the reasons that I love The Shining so much, is that when I saw it as a kid, and I think I was 10 or 11 when I first saw it, and it made an impact because I saw the story of an extra sensitive child whose father wanted to destroy that child for their extra sensitivity. And growing up in a very violent home, that was something I deeply related to. So whenever something is not necessarily explicitly queer, we can still see queerness in it because of our own experiences, and that's just as valid as any other interpretation.
Do you have a favorite Stephen King book, just that you brought it up?
I have several.
Okay.
I think The Dead Zone is sort of Stephen King's Jackie Brown in terms of
Okay.
it's a tale that doesn't have as many horror tropes, but it does have beautiful characterizations and a very complex story that feels very mature and sophisticated, because it's not taking advantage of a killer dog, a killer car, the undead. It's one man's sort of struggle with his role in the world and his perception of that world. And so it's a very mature work, and one of my favorites. Pet Cemetery is the one that I probably was the most scared reading. I remember turning on my it's the first, I think it's the only time where I was like, I need to turn on a light when I go to bed. Because I couldn't stop seeing dead baby Gage in my hallway with a scalpel. There's so many, Stephen King books that I adore. Salem's Lot is another one. I feel like there's a lot of queer codedness in Salem's Lot with the Mark Petrie character, who's introduced to the audience being queer bashed on the playground and then beats the shit out of his bully. So for me, right off the bat, I got a queer protagonist who loves horror and also can beat the shit out of his bullies. And even though Stephen King may not have intended that character to be queer, the fact that he was being bullied for being queer was something that was incredibly relatable for me.
And speaking of queer cinema and Stephen King, did you have anything to do with casting Patricia Clarkson in Carrie 2002?
Yes, that was
that's a great choice. Yeah.
I think it's a deeply flawed adaptation of the material, but Patricia Clarkson and Angela Bettis killed it, and were so incredible. But I don't think there's any beating the De Palma original.
I mean, I love it. And thank you for having this conversation with me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. And have you seen all 3 episodes? Or...
Yes, I have seen them. Yeah. So congrats. It's great. People are going to love it.
Did you have a favorite?
Probably the first episode, because of all like the gothic sort of classic horror context that I didn't know so much about. And also the Bride of Frankenstein stuff was just great. So the first one. She's
an icon. Well, the first one, you probably saw the 2 hour. That's actually 2 episodes.
I did. Yes. Okay. So somewhere
the Bride is in episode 2. Yeah.
Ah, okay. Good to know. All right.
Yeah.
Well, it was really great meeting you. And I hope
you too, Josh.
Bye for now.